It started with a phone call. Not just any phone call. One that could alter the course of a royal dynasty, shake the foundations of a family, and spark conversations across living rooms, boardrooms, and tabloids around the world. Prince Harry, a man who had spent his life living in the glare of public scrutiny, a life carefully scripted and polished for the cameras, had finally reached his breaking point. And he wanted out. The words he whispered, or perhaps shouted, in a fit of frustration and raw emotion, were simple, terrifying, and final. I want a divorce. My decision is final. But how had it come to this? And more importantly, what did it mean for everyone involved? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Ask yourself this. Could you imagine living a life where every word you say, every breath you take, is scrutinized, analyzed, and judged by millions? For Harry, this was his daily reality. From childhood, he had been groomed to serve, to smile, to perform. He had learned to hide pain behind jokes, to mask frustration behind charm, and to obey a family legacy that often felt heavier than a crown. Yet, despite all the appearances, despite all the public bravado, there was a private world he had kept hidden, a world filled with doubt, frustration, and emotional exhaustion. And in that world, a decision had been forming, quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The palace corridors were lined with portraits of stoic ancestors, their eyes following every visitor, every whispered conversation. And in those very corridors, Harry had spent countless hours weighing his options. Should he continue to endure? To smile for the cameras? To obey unspoken rules that suffocated him? Or should he finally, courageously, walk away? The choice was not easy. It had implications that went far beyond him and Meghan, far beyond their immediate circle, reaching into the very heart of what the monarchy represented. And yet, something inside him refused to compromise any longer. What makes this story even more compelling is that it is happening now, in a moment when the world has never been more connected, more opinionated, more ready to judge. Every gesture, every facial expression, every tweet and headline can ignite a firestorm. And the timing could not be more dramatic. Reports had surfaced of late-night confrontations, tense dinners, and heated text exchanges. Allies and enemies were emerging from every corner of the palace, each with a stake in the unfolding drama. The tension was palpable. Even the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. But no one, not even the closest confidants, could predict the final act. Imagine, for a moment, being trapped between love and duty, between family loyalty and personal freedom, between the expectations of a public that has idolized you since birth and your own private need for self-preservation. This is the crucible in which Harry found himself. It is a pressure cooker of emotion, loyalty, secrecy, and desire. And the decision he had made, the declaration that he wanted a divorce, was the culmination of years of internal conflict, public pressure, and private heartbreak. He was no longer a prince obeying the scripts of others. He was a man taking control of his life, consequences be damned. But what led to this decisive moment? Was it a series of small betrayals, building quietly over time, like cracks forming in the foundation of a house? Or was it a single, catastrophic event, a trigger that shattered his patience and forced him to act? Perhaps it was a mixture of both, a complex web of circumstances that no outsider could fully understand. And yet, the consequences were clear. This decision would reverberate through the palace and across the globe. Friends would be forced to pick sides. Family bonds would be tested, strained, and perhaps even broken. And public opinion, unpredictable and merciless, would explode. Harry's relationship with Meghan had been under the microscope since the beginning. Every gesture, every public appearance, every intimate moment captured by the relentless lens of the media was dissected. And while the public often saw glamour and fairy tale moments, the private reality was far more complicated. Arguments behind closed doors, whispers of discontent, late-night tears, and strategic discussions about the future of their lives all painted a very different picture. This story is not just about divorce. It is about identity, autonomy, the struggle for self-determination under extreme scrutiny. And it is about what it truly costs to live a life under the weight of history and expectation. Consider this. Harry was not just any man walking away from a marriage. He was a prince, a figurehead, someone whose every action carries symbolic weight. His declaration of divorce is not simply a personal choice. It is a statement to a family, to a nation, to the world. It is a challenge to centuries of tradition, a confrontation with expectations, and a declaration that even those born into royalty have the right to choose their own path. And yet, with that power comes peril. The backlash, the scrutiny, the inevitable public spectacle, all of it was waiting for him. Every step forward would be observed, analyzed, and debated. And then there were the whispers, those quiet, insidious murmurs that always accompany high-stakes decisions in royal circles. Could he trust those around him? Which confidants would remain loyal, and which would betray him at the first opportunity? The palace had its share of observers, advisors, and manipulators, each with their own agendas. And in a world where information is power, even a single leak could tip the balance. The danger was real, and yet, Harry moved forward. The decision had been made. The course was set, and there was no turning back. Now, picture the moment he actually spoke the words aloud. Perhaps it was in a quiet room, with only a few witnesses, or perhaps over a phone call that would later become the subject of speculation and rumor. The words themselves carried weight. I want a divorce. Short, direct, irrevocable. The phrase echoed not just through the room, but through the corridors of power, through the media outlets poised for coverage, and through the hearts of those who had watched him grow up. It was a sentence heavy with consequence, charged with emotion, and poised to change lives. And yet, there was one thing everyone underestimated: Harry's resolve. But even as he took this decisive step, the uncertainty remained. What would come next? How would the palace respond? How would Meghan react? How would the public interpret this unprecedented move? And most importantly, what hidden revelations lay just beneath the surface, ready to emerge at the worst possible moment? These are the questions that keep the world glued to every headline, every rumor, every carefully orchestrated public appearance. And they are the questions we are about to explore in excruciating detail as we uncover the story behind Harry's decision, the drama, the betrayal, the revelations, and the personal cost of a choice few could imagine making. But before we dive into the heart of the matter, let's pause and consider this. When a man raised to serve, to obey, to honor tradition finally says enough. When he chooses himself over duty, love over expectation, freedom over obligation, what does that truly mean? And what comes next, after such a declaration, can change everything, not just for him, but for the entire royal family. And make no mistake, what comes next is far from simple. It is a journey of deception, heartbreak, loyalty tested, and secrets finally coming to light. And if you think you know the story already, think again. What we are about to reveal will surprise you. Because this is not just a tale of divorce. It is a story about power, pressure, love, and betrayal. It is about a man who dared to break free and the consequences that followed. And as we begin, I have to ask you this. If you were in Harry's shoes, could you do the same? Could you walk away when the stakes are so high, when the world is watching, when history is waiting to judge you? Keep that question in mind, because the answers, the drama, and the revelations are about to unfold, and what comes next will change everything. And just when you think you've grasped the situation, the first bombshell drops. A secret message, a leaked document, a revelation no one saw coming. The events set in motion by this decision will spiral, drawing friends and foes alike into a drama that refuses to be contained. The countdown has begun. The drama is about to unfold, and the first chapter, where the story truly begins, is waiting to reveal the full scope of the storm that Harry has unleashed. This is the story of Prince Harry, the prince who refused to stay silent, the man who declared his independence, the figure whose life and choices will be dissected and debated for years to come. And it all begins with one simple, powerful, terrifying statement: I want a divorce. My decision is final. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when a man who has spent his entire life trying to please everyone finally reaches the end of his rope? When does silence become complicity and obedience become a cage? For Prince Harry, the breaking point had arrived, and it had arrived in a way that nobody in the palace could have anticipated. It was late, far later than anyone should have been awake in the corridors of royal responsibility. The air in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if it were aware of the storm brewing within one of its most famous residents. Harry sat alone in a room that had once been filled with laughter, with childhood memories of carefree days, with the illusions of a life that promised duty and honor but often delivered pain and confinement. He stared at the walls, at the portraits of kings and queens who had worn their crowns with dignity, many of whom had also carried burdens the public would never understand. And he wondered, is this what my life is meant to be? To live in the shadow of expectations that aren't mine? The breaking point didn't announce itself with a single dramatic event. It didn't arrive with fireworks or fanfare. It was quieter than that. A slow, insidious build-up. A series of tiny betrayals, little missteps, miscommunications, and misunderstandings. A glance from a family member that cut sharper than any sword. A conversation that started as casual but ended with a dagger of judgment. And the whispers. The endless whispers. Those quiet voices in hallways, in staff quarters, behind closed doors, spreading rumors, speculating, dissecting. Every whisper chipped away at the fortress of patience Harry had built around himself. Do you know that feeling when your world tilts just slightly, imperceptibly, until one day it tips entirely over? That was Harry's reality. Each slight, each passive-aggressive comment, each reminder of the duties he had inherited but never fully embraced, added weight. He had tried to talk about it, tried to reason, tried to compromise. But in a life where every word is measured, every gesture analyzed, compromise often feels like surrender. And surrender was not in Harry's nature. The night had started like any other. Dinner had passed with polite conversation that barely disguised the tension. Guests had left, and the house had settled into its usual quiet, except for the low hum of tension that seemed to resonate in every corner. Harry retreated to the solitude of his private chambers, a sanctuary that felt increasingly like a cell. He thought about Meghan, about the life they had tried to build, the moments of joy, the whispered conversations that only the two of them shared. But even with her presence, he felt isolated. The walls that surrounded him were not just physical. They were the invisible walls of tradition, expectation, and judgment. And then came the text. It wasn't a bombshell at first glance. Just a few lines, a casual message that might have seemed insignificant to an outsider. But to Harry, it was the final straw. It was the message that crystallized years of frustration into a single, unambiguous realization. He could no longer stay silent. He could no longer pretend. He could no longer endure the constant pressure of living a life dictated by others. And in that moment, the decision he had been contemplating for months, perhaps years, became inevitable. Have you ever had a moment when everything suddenly becomes clear, when the path forward is undeniable, even if terrifying? That's what Harry felt. The message had lit a fire that could not be extinguished. His mind raced. He thought about the conversations he had had with advisors, the off-the-record discussions with trusted friends, the late-night calls with Meghan, where they whispered their frustrations, shared their fears, and plotted a course that no one else could comprehend. The breaking point is not always visible to the world. People see the dramatic gestures, the public statements, the headlines. But the real breaking point is private, intimate, silent, yet seismic. It is the moment when a person realizes that continuing to conform, to endure, to obey, is no longer an option, that the cost of staying is far greater than the fear of leaving. For Harry, that moment came not with a fight or a confrontation, but in the quiet of his room, staring at the walls that had contained him for so long. He thought about his parents, their lives, their mistakes, their triumphs. He thought about the ways in which he had tried to honor his father's wishes, his brother's expectations, and the crown itself. But all of it felt hollow now. The weight of history, of legacy, of expectation was crushing, and he realized that breaking free would not just be an act of personal liberation. It would be a statement, a declaration, a revolt against everything he had been taught to value. Yet there was fear. Fear of public opinion, fear of judgment, fear of alienating the very people he loved, fear of what the media would say, of what social media would explode into. Every news outlet, every blog, every Twitter account would dissect his every move. The glare of the world was relentless. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, Harry's resolve hardened. He had reached the point of no return. And so he made the call. Or maybe it was a message. Perhaps both. The precise medium hardly mattered. What mattered was the declaration. The words that had been forming in his mind for months, finally finding voice. I want a divorce. My decision is final. There was no hesitation, no ambiguity, no room for negotiation. It was a line drawn in the sand, a door closing, and another opening, one that would take him out of the life he had known and into a future he would define himself. But even as the words left him, the consequences loomed. He could feel them, intangible yet immense, stretching across rooms, hallways, and the very corridors of the palace itself. What would Charles think? What would William say? How would Meghan react? And what about the staff, the advisors, the friends who had once been loyal? Could any of them understand what it meant to reach a breaking point that could not be undone? This was not just about a divorce. It was about identity, about autonomy, about reclaiming a life that had been circumscribed by duty, expectation, and relentless scrutiny. For Harry, it was about asserting control over a destiny that had long been dictated by others. But the path forward was fraught with uncertainty, danger, and potential betrayal. Every step would be scrutinized, every choice second-guessed, every interaction analyzed for hidden meaning. And yet, he had made the leap. Have you ever wondered what it takes to stand up, finally, for yourself when the stakes are impossibly high? To break free from obligations, from fear, from expectation, and embrace the unknown? That is the story we are about to explore. And it begins here, at the moment Harry reached his breaking point. When silence was no longer an option, when conformity was no longer acceptable, when the only choice left was to declare his truth and face whatever storm might come. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Could a family, bound by blood, tradition, and centuries of ceremony, truly fracture from within? Could loyalty and love crumble under the weight of expectation and secrecy? For Prince Harry, the realization that his breaking point had arrived was only the beginning. What followed was the slow, painful unraveling of the bonds he had once thought unbreakable, a rift that would stretch from the quiet chambers of the palace to the very public eye of the world. The tension was almost tangible. Imagine walking into a room and feeling every eye turn on you. But instead of warmth, you sense judgment. Every glance carries an accusation. Every silence feels like condemnation. That was Harry's life for decades. And now, after his private declaration, the air had shifted. Something had changed. The quiet obedience that once kept the palace's delicate machinery moving smoothly had been replaced by uncertainty. Every conversation was loaded with subtext, every interaction potentially explosive. The royal household had its own ecosystem, and for the first time, Harry felt like a predator in a lion's den rather than a participant in a carefully orchestrated dance. It all began subtly. Family dinners, which had always been polished, polite, and carefully curated for the public eye, now felt like battlefields. Words that would have once been dismissed or ignored were now dissected, loaded with meaning. A comment about protocol, a raised eyebrow, a sigh at the wrong moment, all of it carried weight. Tension had become an unspoken language in the household, a code everyone understood, except it was impossible to decode fully without consequence. And Harry, once adept at navigating these currents, now found himself pushed into reactive survival mode. Do you know that feeling when every familiar place starts to feel foreign, even hostile? That's what the palace had become for him. Hallways seemed narrower, rooms colder, portraits of ancestors now looming, silent judges of every thought, every choice, every emotion. Even those he had trusted began to look at him differently. Allies turned hesitant, words carefully measured before being spoken. And in this atmosphere, even minor disagreements escalated. Every interaction risked becoming a battlefield. The rift extended far beyond mere glances or awkward silences. It seeped into decisions that affected daily life, private routines, and ceremonial responsibilities. Once simple obligations became pressure points. Attending an event wasn't about the honor or the cause. It was about navigating alliances, interpreting hidden messages, and avoiding missteps that could be weaponized. And the deeper Harry went into this maze, the more he realized how fragile everything truly was. Relationships, reputations, trust, they were all conditional, all precarious, and suddenly, they seemed to hang by the thinnest of threads. The irony was almost unbearable. Here was a prince, trained from birth in diplomacy and etiquette, suddenly overwhelmed by the subtleties of his own family dynamics. William, his older brother, remained a figure of stoicism, polished and controlled, but increasingly distant. Conversations with William that once carried camaraderie were now laced with tension, subtle jabs, and unspoken comparisons. Each interaction became a test: loyalty, intention, truth. Every smile, every nod, every remark was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Charles, ever the figurehead of authority, was no different. Where once Harry had sought guidance and approval, he now felt suffocated by judgment and expectation. Every decision, personal or professional, became a potential source of disappointment, an opportunity for rebuke. And with Meghan entering this complex web of family dynamics, alliances and tensions shifted even further. She was both an ally and, in the eyes of some, a destabilizing presence. Her influence on Harry was undeniable, yet it created fissures between him and the rest of the family, as old loyalties collided with the reality of his growing independence. In many ways, the palace operated like a chessboard, each move carefully considered, each player positioning themselves strategically. But in this game, Harry had finally decided to play his own hand, and the consequences were immediate. Advisors who had once been neutral now looked at him suspiciously. Staff who had followed his lead hesitated, wondering where loyalties truly lay. And within this climate of uncertainty, rumors began to swirl, quiet at first, whispered in corridors, then amplified by the ever-watchful media. And the public, of course, had their own role. Every subtle shift, every minor gesture was magnified, dissected, and debated across newspapers, television programs, and social media feeds. Harry's private struggle had quickly become a global spectacle. Yet while the public thought they were watching the unfolding drama, they only saw fragments, carefully curated glimpses, moments captured out of context. The full story, the internal struggles, the private conflicts, the intense emotions, remained hidden behind the closed doors of the palace. Have you ever felt a distance grow between you and someone you once trusted implicitly? Harry experienced that on a monumental scale. Friends he had relied upon, cousins and advisors, even distant relatives, began to shift subtly. Some offered support quietly, carefully, with caution. Others watched, waiting for the moment when the storm might consume him. And in that space of uncertainty, paranoia began to creep in. Who could be trusted? Who was simply waiting to capitalize on a misstep? And more importantly, could the family survive such a fracture, or was the rupture inevitable? The rift was compounded by history. Past grievances, unspoken conflicts, and long-buried misunderstandings suddenly resurfaced. Every misstep from decades ago was now potential ammunition. Every childhood slight, every perceived betrayal, every moment of hurt was being reinterpreted in the light of this new reality. And Harry, acutely aware of the stakes, felt the pressure mounting. It was no longer just a family disagreement. It was a potential public scandal, a personal battle, and a test of endurance all rolled into one. And yet, despite the tension, despite the emotional exhaustion, despite the whispers and judgment, Harry was resolute. He had reached a point where compliance was no longer an option. He could feel the rift widening with every passing day, every interaction, every misinterpreted glance. The family he had once adored, the relationships he had cherished, were now fractured in ways that might never fully heal. And the deeper the fissure grew, the clearer it became. The divorce he had contemplated in the quiet of his chambers was not just inevitable, it was necessary. But even as he steeled himself, there were moments of doubt. Could he withstand the backlash? Could he survive the media storm, the family drama, the inevitable public scrutiny? And what about the consequences for Meghan, for their relationship, for the life they were trying to build together? Every step forward carried risk. Every decision had ramifications far beyond the walls of the palace. And yet, he could feel a strange clarity in this storm, a certainty that he had never felt before. Then came the first confrontation. Not a public one, not yet. A private meeting, tense and charged with emotion, that would mark the beginning of the true unraveling. Words were exchanged that cut sharper than any sword. Accusations, defensiveness, anger, and heartbreak collided in a room where every second seemed to stretch into eternity. The allies he thought he had were revealed to be cautious at best, the enemies emboldened. And Harry, standing firm in his decision, realized that the rift was no longer something that could be managed quietly. It was a rupture that demanded action. What happened in that room would set the tone for the next series of events. Every conversation afterward, every decision, every movement in the public eye would carry the weight of this confrontation. The royal rift was no longer theoretical. It was real, tangible, and impossible to ignore. And yet, even as the tension mounted, Harry knew that this was only the beginning. The fractures he had uncovered in his family, the conflicts he had brought to the surface, would soon collide with forces he could not fully anticipate. And then, just as he thought he had reached the peak of tension, an unexpected message arrived. Not from William, not from Charles, not even from Meghan. Someone else, someone whose intentions were unclear, whose loyalty was questionable, had inserted themselves into the drama. And this message, seemingly innocent at first, contained a revelation that would escalate the royal rift to a level nobody had anticipated. The palace had never seen anything like it. Alliances would shift, trust would be tested, secrets would spill, and Harry, already at the breaking point, would be forced to navigate an entirely new layer of betrayal and intrigue, one that threatened not just his family relationships, but his very sense of stability and control. And just when you think the storm could not intensify any further, the first public leak hits. A photograph, a quote, a misinterpreted gesture. The press seizes on it immediately. Social media erupts. Headlines scream. Commentary spirals. And all the private pain, all the strategic maneuvering, all the careful planning. Suddenly, the world is watching, judging, and waiting for the next move. But what came next would push the rift to unimaginable extremes, and no one, not even Harry, could have predicted the domino effect that was about to begin. What if the life you thought you knew was built on whispers and half-truths? What if every interaction, every smile, every casual conversation carried a hidden agenda? For Prince Harry, the royal rift was only the surface. Beneath it lay a network of secrets so intricate, so deeply buried, that even those closest to him might never have guessed their existence. And now, these secrets were beginning to surface, threatening to engulf everything he had fought to protect. It started with the messages, subtle, almost innocuous, that hinted at something more. An offhand remark in a conversation. A carefully worded letter left in a drawer. A whispered comment from a staff member who had been around the palace longer than most of the younger royals had been alive. Each detail alone might have seemed trivial, but together, they painted a picture that was shocking, contradictory, and dangerous. Have you ever discovered something about someone you thought you knew so well that it completely changed how you saw them? That's exactly how Harry felt. For years, he had trusted, assumed, and acted on the belief that the palace operated on honor, duty, and loyalty. But behind the ornate walls and gilded doors, a different story was unfolding. Allies were hiding motives. Conversations were being filtered, distorted, and delivered selectively. And those he had assumed were loyal confidants were suddenly shadows of ambiguity, their allegiance uncertain. One of the earliest shocks came from documents that were never meant to be seen. Private correspondence, notes tucked away in secure files, emails that had been accidentally misdirected, all converged to form a narrative that challenged everything Harry thought he knew about his family, their intentions, and the pressures that had shaped him. Some of the revelations were petty, almost laughable on the surface. Criticisms of his choices, sarcastic remarks about his personal life, subtle undermining of his relationships. But others were darker, hinting at manipulations, withheld information, and deliberate strategies designed to control outcomes behind the scenes. And then there were the conversations he overheard, the ones that were never intended for his ears. Walking past a side corridor, he caught fragments of discussions between advisors and family members. Remarks that, at first, seemed innocuous. "We'll need to guide him. He's too impulsive. This could be a problem for the public image." But taken together, they revealed a level of orchestration that was both unsettling and enraging. Was this guidance? Or was it manipulation? Where did loyalty end and control begin? You might think the worst betrayals are loud, dramatic, explosive. But often, the most damaging ones are quiet, invisible, and insidious. Harry was discovering this firsthand. Each secret added layers of tension, mistrust, and emotional fatigue. How could he continue to navigate a world where even the most mundane interactions might conceal hidden intentions? Who could he trust? And what were the consequences if he acted on incomplete or misleading information? Some of the revelations directly involved Meghan. For all the support and loyalty she had shown, there were whispers of influence, of perceived manipulation. Not from her, necessarily, but from those interpreting her presence as destabilizing. Every private conversation she had with Harry, every strategic decision, every public appearance was scrutinized, misinterpreted, and discussed. And while Harry knew her intentions were genuine, the palace's interpretation created further tension, widening the rift and reinforcing the sense of isolation he felt. But the secrets didn't stop there. There were financial discrepancies, decisions made in the shadows, and undisclosed obligations that added pressure to an already fragile situation. Royal finances are always complex, but Harry began to realize just how opaque and inaccessible some of the mechanisms were, even to those within the family. Certain expenditures, secret allocations, and confidential arrangements were being kept from him. Information that, if he had known earlier, might have altered his perspective on past decisions, responsibilities, and even alliances. And then came the most shocking discovery. Evidence that communications between some advisors and external parties had been deliberately hidden from him. Messages intercepted, files edited, conversations erased or recontextualized. These weren't mistakes or oversights. They were deliberate acts of omission and manipulation. Someone was controlling the narrative, and for Harry, realizing this was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant he had been navigating a maze blindfolded, and liberating because now he understood the full stakes. Have you ever had the unsettling feeling that everyone around you is playing a game you didn't even know existed? That's exactly where Harry found himself. Every word he said, every action he took, could be misinterpreted or weaponized. Every alliance could be fragile. Every gesture could have unintended consequences. And yet, despite this, he began to see a pattern, a map of intentions, strategies, and secrets that allowed him to anticipate the next moves, even if only partially. Some of the secrets were personal, intimate, and painful. Stories from childhood, private moments that had been twisted or suppressed, relationships that had been misrepresented. These revelations carried emotional weight that public scandals could never match. They affected Harry's sense of self, his memories, and his understanding of family loyalty. For a man who had always been conscious of his public image, these private betrayals cut deeper, leaving wounds that could not be seen by anyone outside the palace walls. Even more complicated were the contradictions he discovered. Public statements that conflicted with private actions. Promises made but never kept. Allegiances claimed but never honored. And yet, all of this existed within a framework that, from the outside, appeared orderly, dignified, and impeccable. The contrast was jarring. To the world, the palace was a symbol of stability and tradition. Inside, Harry now understood, it was often a battleground of secrecy, power, and manipulation. As the tension mounted, Harry began documenting everything, compiling evidence of these hidden truths. Private journals, confidential letters, and discreet recordings became tools of clarity in a world of confusion. And in doing so, he realized something crucial. Knowledge is power, but awareness alone is not enough. Action would be necessary. Decisions would have to be made. And every choice carried consequences far beyond personal stakes. And then, the most alarming secret came to light. It involved a figure he had trusted implicitly, someone whose guidance he had relied upon for years. Evidence emerged that this trusted ally had been acting independently, controlling information, and subtly steering outcomes without Harry's knowledge. It was a betrayal in its purest form, strategic, calculated, and potentially catastrophic. The implications were enormous. If this secret became public, it would not only affect Harry but could destabilize the relationships he had worked to protect, including with Meghan. The palace atmosphere became almost unrecognizable. Rooms that had once felt safe now seemed perilous. Conversations were carefully rehearsed. Every interaction was a potential minefield. And for Harry, the emotional toll was immense. Anger, frustration, fear, and sorrow collided, creating a storm of emotion that was difficult to contain. Each day became a careful balance of diplomacy, strategy, and self-preservation. And yet, amidst all the secrecy, there was clarity. Harry realized that understanding these hidden truths gave him leverage, insight, and a pathway forward. The breaking point he had experienced earlier was no longer just emotional. It was strategic. He could now navigate the rift, anticipate moves, and plan actions that might have previously been impossible. But even with this advantage, the stakes were higher than ever. One misstep could undo everything. One leak, one miscommunication, one public misstep could ignite a scandal beyond measure. Have you ever uncovered something so profound that it simultaneously empowers and terrifies you? That was Harry's reality. The secrets behind closed doors were no longer hidden. They were revealed, understood, and weighed. And yet, the consequences were not fully realized. The palace was a ticking time bomb of emotion, politics, and secrecy, and Harry now held the detonator. And then it happened. A new revelation, one that nobody had expected. A private document, long thought secure, leaked into Harry's hands. It contained information so explosive that it could redefine the rift entirely, changing the balance of power, the alliances, and the stakes. Every thread of secrecy, every hidden truth, suddenly converged into a single, undeniable reality. Nothing would ever be the same. But what came next would push Harry, Meghan, and the entire royal household into uncharted territory, and the consequences would be impossible to predict. Have you ever wondered what it's like to live in two worlds at once? One that the world sees, polished and picture-perfect, and another that exists behind closed doors, raw and unfiltered, where every decision is tangled with emotion, pressure, and unspoken fear? For Prince Harry, the divide between public and private life had never been more stark or more dangerous. On the surface, the prince appeared composed, smiling for cameras, attending events, shaking hands, waving from balconies. Public appearances were a delicate dance, each gesture choreographed for perception. The media captured moments frozen in time. Harry laughing with dignitaries, standing beside Meghan, participating in charity events, but behind every smile, a storm was brewing. He had become an actor in a life that was scripted by tradition, expectation, and public scrutiny, and yet the script was cracking at the edges. It wasn't just the events themselves that posed a challenge. It was the constant awareness that every move was being watched. Cameras didn't blink. Journalists didn't forget. Social media didn't forgive. And when your family is one of the most scrutinized in the world, even the smallest misstep is amplified 1,000 times over. Harry had always managed this tension with a blend of charm and deflection, yet lately, the balance was tipping. The private pressure was suffocating. Have you ever felt that gap between how the world perceives you and how you actually feel? That's exactly what Harry lived daily. He could be laughing in public, participating in royal duties, and yet internally wrestling with frustration, anger, and a sense of entrapment. Every event was a performance, every handshake a calculated gesture, every wave a reminder that his life belonged not only to him, but to an entire institution. Even the simplest public engagements became battlegrounds for emotional survival. A charity gala that should have been uplifting turned into an exercise in tension management. Harry observed every glance, every whispered comment, every side conversation. Allies tried to reassure, while others subtly questioned him, probing his resolve, testing his loyalties. Behind his calm demeanor, a storm raged. He understood that any outward sign of weakness would be exploited, magnified, and misrepresented. And yet, suppressing emotion came at a personal cost that grew heavier with each passing day. The private world, in contrast, was chaotic and unrelenting. Late-night conversations with Meghan, discussions about future strategies, private arguments that never touched public ears. All of it created a pressure cooker of emotion. Decisions that seemed simple to the outside observer were weighed down by centuries of tradition, familial expectation, and the ever-present threat of misinterpretation. Harry often wondered if anyone outside his inner circle could truly grasp the complexity of his situation. Could the public understand the emotional calculus behind every action, the strategic thinking hidden beneath every smile? What's worse, the private realm was infiltrated by secrecy and duplicity. Messages intercepted, advisors whispering agendas, and family members conveying hidden meanings. Harry had to navigate a labyrinth where every step was uncertain. In public, the world saw unity, polish, and composure. In private, he experienced mistrust, subtle manipulation, and a constant weighing of risk versus reward. The duality was exhausting. Every decision had two layers: how it would play out behind closed doors and how it would appear to the world. Both layers carried immense weight. Then came the media pressure, relentless and unforgiving. Headlines screamed interpretations that were often inaccurate, commentary exploded on social media, and gossip became currency. One small gesture, misread by the public, could ignite global speculation. Harry found himself trapped in a feedback loop where private anxiety fueled public appearances, which then fueled further scrutiny. It was a cycle with no natural break. Even the best-laid plans to maintain privacy often failed. Every action, every word, every glance became a potential story. And yet, Harry wasn't powerless. In private, he could act strategically. He could control certain narratives, influence timing, and navigate conversations. But the challenge was maintaining authenticity while operating under constant surveillance. He had to appear calm, collected, and dutiful, even as private turmoil threatened to spill over. The tension between public image and private reality created an emotional roller coaster. Highs that were fleeting and lows that were crushing. Imagine trying to protect a family, your marriage, and your personal dignity while the entire world watches your every move. For Harry, it was a daily negotiation between survival and authenticity. Public expectations demanded compliance. Private knowledge demanded resistance. He learned to compartmentalize, to mask fear and frustration, to maintain an outward persona while processing a turbulent inner life. But compartmentalization has limits. Even the most disciplined individual eventually feels the strain. Direct experiences in the public highlighted these tensions. During an official engagement, Harry caught a fleeting glance from a royal advisor. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, but charged with meaning. Was it approval? Disapproval? A silent warning? He couldn't be sure. And in the next moment, cameras flashed, questions were asked, and every second was replayed and dissected across the globe. One private miscalculation had public consequences that could spiral uncontrollably. Meanwhile, private moments with Meghan offered some relief, yet also revealed vulnerabilities. They shared strategies, vented frustrations, and whispered possibilities for the future, yet even these discussions carried weight. Each decision they contemplated could impact not just their lives, but the stability of the monarchy itself. And even the comfort of private space was tinged with the fear that secrets might escape, alliances might shift, and perceptions might be weaponized. Have you ever had to weigh every word, every action, every breath, knowing that mistakes could be catastrophic? That was Harry's reality. Public smiles masked private anguish. Public gestures concealed private strategy. And every day, the stakes escalated. The pressure created an environment where even minor disagreements carried the weight of potential global headlines. The line between personal choice and institutional expectation blurred until it almost vanished entirely. Then came the first incident that would forever highlight this duality. A minor slip during a public engagement. A handshake misinterpreted, a smile deemed insincere, a moment of hesitation in a speech. The reaction was immediate. Headlines, social media commentary, speculation, and rumor. Privately, Harry felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. How could something so minor become such a spectacle? And yet, he knew the answer. In his world, everything was amplified. Every detail mattered. Every gesture could become a symbol. Every misstep could be weaponized. And with the public watching, the palace reacting, and private truths still bubbling under the surface, Harry realized that his next decisions would carry weight unlike anything he had faced before. The divide between his public and private life was no longer a manageable tension. It was a battlefield. He had to navigate both worlds simultaneously, anticipate reactions, and protect the life he wanted to create for himself and Meghan. But just as he began to strategize, an unexpected leak reached the press. Private information, previously thought secure, surfaced online. The public narrative began to twist, rumors proliferated, and global speculation reached a fever pitch. What was once a private struggle had become a public spectacle overnight, and the divide between his public and private lives widened into a chasm. And what came next would force Harry to confront not just the world's perception of him, but the very nature of his own choices, and no one could predict the fallout that was about to erupt. Could one person really change the course of a life so entangled with tradition, expectation, and scrutiny? For Prince Harry, Meghan Markle was more than a partner. She was a catalyst, a confidant, and, in many ways, a mirror reflecting both the freedom he craved and the constraints he endured. But with influence comes scrutiny, and the closer Harry leaned on Meghan, the more the palace and the world watched, judged, and speculated. From the outside, their relationship appeared idyllic. Smiles, hand-holding, public appearances filled with affection and solidarity. A modern fairy tale. But those who had been close to Harry understood that Meghan's role went far beyond public charm. She was a strategist, a voice of clarity, and someone unafraid to challenge assumptions, even those rooted in centuries of tradition. And while Harry valued her insight, this influence also became a point of contention within the royal family. Every decision he made, every public action, every private choice could now be interpreted as being under her sway. Have you ever noticed how influence can be both empowering and isolating? That was Meghan's impact on Harry. She gave him courage to assert his desires, to speak truths he had long suppressed. She validated his frustrations and provided strategies for navigating palace politics that Harry had struggled to confront alone. Yet, the same influence made him a target. Critics labeled him easily swayed, undermined by his spouse, or worse, manipulated. Privately, he knew the reality was far different. Meghan did not manipulate. She illuminated possibilities Harry had been too constrained to see. Their bond became a secret power base. In quiet conversations late at night, away from cameras and staff, they planned, discussed, and sometimes disagreed. Meghan challenged Harry in ways that forced him to confront fears he had long buried. Did he want loyalty over authenticity? Tradition over personal freedom? Family approval over personal happiness? Each question was a test. And Meghan's influence was subtle but relentless. She didn't push, she illuminated, she provoked reflection. Yet, for all the empowerment, the influence brought friction. Family members, advisors, and courtiers began interpreting every interaction as a potential wedge. Was Meghan guiding Harry's decisions for his own good? Or was she seen as an interloper, destabilizing the delicate balance of the monarchy? Rumors spread quietly at first, whispered criticisms of her background, her independence, her directness. And with every subtle comment, the rift widened, not just between Harry and the institution, but between Harry and those he had always considered allies within his family. Have you ever felt that someone's influence in your life was so strong that it shifted not only your actions, but how others perceived you? That was Harry's dilemma. Every conversation with Meghan, every plan they made together, every strategic move was scrutinized. Media outlets, palace insiders, and even distant family members debated whether Harry acted independently or at Meghan's direction. It became impossible to separate Harry's choices from Meghan's influence in the eyes of the world, and often, even within the palace walls. The power of Meghan's influence was undeniable. She encouraged Harry to speak openly about mental health, to set boundaries with the press, and to stand firm against protocols he had long found oppressive. She pushed him to articulate truths he had buried, both privately and publicly. For Harry, this was liberating. It gave him the clarity he had long lacked. Yet clarity came with consequences. Every decision made in collaboration with Meghan was now interpreted as a challenge to family authority, an act of rebellion against centuries of royal convention. And then there were the private confrontations. Not public spats, not media headlines, but intense discussions about what freedom, duty, and personal happiness really meant. Meghan questioned Harry on difficult choices, the compromises he had made, and the patterns he had allowed to dictate his life. In turn, Harry sometimes bristled at her directness. Did she understand the full weight of centuries of expectation? Could she truly grasp what it meant to be scrutinized, to live under a microscope, to navigate a world where even small missteps could become international scandals? And yet, each challenge brought growth, awareness, and a renewed sense of purpose. The influence extended beyond strategy and emotional support. Meghan's perspective offered a lens through which Harry could view the monarchy with critical eyes. She highlighted inconsistencies, questioned motives, and revealed hypocrisies that Harry had long ignored or rationalized. What seemed like loyalty at one level was, in reality, sometimes manipulation or self-interest. What appeared as guidance was occasionally control. And recognizing these patterns gave Harry the insight to navigate the rift with more confidence. But it also intensified the scrutiny he faced. Have you ever felt that someone's presence amplified both your strengths and your vulnerabilities? Meghan's impact on Harry was precisely that. She emboldened him, yet it also made him more exposed. Allies who had once been silent became critics. Opponents saw her as a threat, and through her, Harry became a lightning rod for criticism, speculation, and rumor. Every decision, public or private, now had an added layer of interpretation, the question of influence. Was Harry acting autonomously, or was Meghan directing the course? In the court of public and familial opinion, perception was everything. And then came the first major incident. A private discussion between Harry and Meghan, meant only for the two of them, was inadvertently overheard, or perhaps deliberately leaked, by someone within the palace. The content was benign, strategic musings about personal boundaries and future planning, yet it was immediately spun into a narrative of manipulation. Headlines erupted. Social media erupted. Allegiances were questioned. And for Harry, the private world he had tried to protect was suddenly exposed, vulnerable to misinterpretation, judgment, and political maneuvering. The incident forced Harry to confront a difficult reality. Meghan's influence was both a strength and a risk. It gave him clarity, courage, and perspective, yet it also intensified the scrutiny, increased the pressure, and widened the rift within the palace. Every choice they made together now carried public and familial consequences far beyond their control. Every strategy, every decision, had to balance personal freedom with political awareness, love with optics, and strategy with human emotion. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the leaks and scrutiny, Harry leaned on Meghan more than ever. He realized that without her, he might not have found the courage to confront the breaking point, to navigate the rift, or to assert his autonomy. Her influence was the catalyst that turned frustration into action, fear into determination, and indecision into clarity. But he also knew that this influence would continue to draw attention, provoke judgment, and exacerbate existing tensions. The stakes were higher than ever, and every step forward would be closely watched. Have you ever relied on someone so completely that their presence shapes not only your actions, but your perception of the world itself? That is what Meghan represented for Harry. She was ally, mirror, and strategist. And in a world where perception often outweighed reality, her influence was both his shield and his target. Every move he made with her by his side could liberate him, or it could become ammunition against him in a battle that extended far beyond personal relationships. Then came the moment that crystallized everything. A family meeting, quiet in appearance but explosive in implication, where Harry's choices, guided by Meghan, were openly challenged. Questions were raised about his judgment, his loyalty, and the role of his spouse. Every argument, every critique, carried the weight of historical expectation, familial scrutiny, and public interpretation. The influence Meghan held over Harry was suddenly in the spotlight, and with it came the inevitable tension between loyalty, love, and perception. And just when it seemed the pressure could not intensify further, a confidential note surfaced, revealing that whispers about Meghan's influence were being circulated among advisors and family members. Whether true or exaggerated, the note had already ignited suspicion and speculation, widening the divide within the household. The palace had become a chessboard, with Meghan's role as a central piece simultaneously empowering Harry and threatening to destabilize everything he had been working to protect. But what came next would escalate the tension beyond anything Harry or Meghan had anticipated, and it would reveal a truth about influence, loyalty, and trust that no one could have foreseen. What if the very money meant to secure your future became a chain around your neck? For Prince Harry, financial pressures were no longer abstract. They were tangible, suffocating, and strategically weaponized. Beyond the public appearances, the royal duties, and the emotional toll of the rift, another layer of pressure was quietly tightening: money. Every transaction, every inheritance, every fund allocation carried implications that went far beyond personal wealth. And hidden beneath the surface were secrets that threatened to destabilize everything Harry had been trying to navigate. It began subtly. At first, it was small inconsistencies, an unexplained expense here, a delayed transfer there, a project that was funded 1 month but mysteriously stalled the next. Individually, these discrepancies might have been overlooked, rationalized, or dismissed. But when patterns began to emerge, a troubling picture formed. Financial oversight in the royal household, Harry realized, was not merely about stewardship. It was about control, influence, and sometimes even manipulation. Have you ever discovered that the resources you assumed were your own were, in fact, heavily restricted or closely monitored? That was Harry's reality. For years, he had believed in the stability of his personal finances, in the autonomy granted by his status, and in the fairness of allocations. But the deeper he delved, the more he uncovered transactions, agreements, and arrangements that raised questions. Certain funds were earmarked in ways he hadn't authorized. Requests for clarity were met with vague explanations or outright deflection. And in the quiet corridors of the palace, subtle pressures were applied to ensure compliance, obedience, and discretion. The irony was brutal. Money, which should have offered freedom, instead became a tool of influence. Every decision Harry wanted to make, every venture he considered, had financial implications that were scrutinized to the point of manipulation. Advisors he had trusted now held financial oversight over projects that were supposed to be under his control. Requests for transparency met resistance. Documents were lost or misfiled. Even seemingly minor details, like travel reimbursements or charitable contributions, were monitored, filtered, and strategically communicated to reinforce a narrative of dependence rather than autonomy. And then there were the secrets. Layers of financial dealings hidden behind formal documentation, classified reports, and private advisories. Accounts that appeared straightforward on the surface were entangled with obligations, undisclosed trusts, and conditions that Harry had never been fully briefed on. Some were historical, going back decades, and many were intentionally opaque. What had been presented as a stable, supportive financial structure was, in truth, a web of hidden expectations and potential leverage points, each with consequences for how Harry could act, publicly and privately. Have you ever felt that the money meant to support you was simultaneously a weapon? That every dollar carried strings attached, unseen conditions, and subtle pressures? That was Harry's predicament. And for someone who had already reached his breaking point emotionally, discovering these financial secrets was like adding fuel to a fire already blazing out of control. Every decision now had dual stakes: personal freedom and financial security, intertwined in ways that were nearly impossible to separate. The impact of these pressures became evident in daily life. Planning public engagements, considering private ventures, or even strategizing for potential independence required navigating a labyrinth of fiscal oversight, compliance demands, and covert monitoring. A plan that seemed simple on paper could be derailed by subtle interventions, an unexplained delay in approval, a miscommunication from an advisor, or an internal directive from a family member that altered expectations without explanation. The palace's financial ecosystem, Harry realized, was as complex, volatile, and opaque as any political battlefield. And yet, he wasn't powerless. Discovering these secrets also provided leverage. Understanding the system's intricacies allowed him to anticipate reactions, negotiate strategically, and protect both his interests and Meghan's. But it required caution. Every move carried risk, and a misstep could trigger suspicion, scrutiny, or even retaliation. The stakes weren't just personal, they were institutional. Decisions Harry made about money could impact not only his family relationships, but also public perception, media narratives, and the stability of the monarchy itself. Then came the shocking discovery: a set of documents, once considered confidential, had been manipulated. Certain expenses had been misrepresented. Funds intended for specific projects had been redirected without proper authorization. Advisors who were supposed to provide oversight had concealed these discrepancies. It wasn't mere mismanagement, it was control through obfuscation. And for Harry, the revelation was staggering. It explained so much: the limitations he had faced, the friction with advisors, the frustrations that had always seemed disproportionate to the situation. Have you ever uncovered a truth that simultaneously clarified everything and made your position more precarious? That was the moment Harry realized just how strategically financial secrecy had been used against him. Money, which should have empowered him, had been leveraged to constrain him. And in that realization, the path forward became both clearer and more dangerous. Clearer, because understanding the system allowed him to anticipate interference. More dangerous, because any action to assert control could be perceived as rebellion or betrayal. Complicating matters further were external pressures. Media speculation, public scrutiny, and social commentary amplified every financial decision, turning even mundane transactions into global talking points. Headlines framed decisions in ways that favored narratives of dependency, manipulation, or irresponsibility. And within the palace, subtle communications reinforced these interpretations, creating a feedback loop of tension, perception, and control. Harry was caught in the center, navigating financial realities, institutional expectations, and public perception simultaneously.